Hi, and welcome back to The Current. This is Pastor Chris Nafis of Living Water Church, and today I am delighted to have joining me on the show Dr. Rebecca Laird, who is the Dean of the School of Theology and Christian Ministry here at Point Loma Nazarene University, where we're recording this episode. She has also been the spiritual director, done a lot of work in pastoral ministry, lived in community, been active in marginalized communities, and just a generally wonderful and amazing person and pastor and professor. We had a great conversation about Henri Nouwen, about spirituality and spiritual direction, wisdom, all sorts of things. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Here it is. All right. Well, Dr. Laird, thank you so much for giving me a little bit of your time and being willing to just kind of invest in our community and in the listeners of this with some of your expertise and your experience and your wisdom. So thanks for joining me.
Wow, my pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Yeah. Not everybody knows. I mean, you're a very famous person, obviously, but not everyone knows who you are. Could you kind of introduce yourself a little bit for us and just tell us your background and what kind of work you do and that kind of thing?
Sure. You make me laugh. My world is a world that's connected to commitments to spiritual formation, urban ministry, education. And so I am at the end of my formal career as the Dean of the School of Theology and Christian Ministry. And I am professor of Christian ministry and practice. So I've spent years in pastoral ministry. Before that, I worked in resources, in books and spirituality publications. And so my whole career over the course of 40-some years has been to help people grow deeper in their faith. And sometimes that's taken an educational route, and sometimes that's taken a resource route or a ministry route. But it seems to me to be all of a piece.
Okay, yeah, and so like I haven't like taken a class with you or anything. I've helped kind of lecture in some of your classes.
Thank you for that.
I've sat in on one of your workshops on spiritual direction, which was really interesting. And so I just kind of know your work mostly through other people being involved in like student ministries. I know some of your pastoral history, and then I know you're doing this deep spiritual direction work. And so you just have like all these different avenues that you're investing in people, right?
Yes. I have felt like a commitment to and a call to ministry was to say yes to being about the gospel wherever I ended up. So I've worked in a variety of types of churches, both suburban and very, very urban. Mm-hmm. And then I've been in educational spaces, both in church education, church-based education or formation, and in higher ed. So the institutions change, but the core commitments have not changed that much.
Yeah, and you're one of those people, there's like certain people that everybody when they say their name, everyone's like, oh, they're so amazing. They're so wonderful. And like, you're one of those people that anytime I hear Dr. Laird, everybody's like, oh man, she's the best. We love her. And she's been so helpful in my life. And, it's just, you're just one of those like people that just, I don't know, invest so deeply in others. And so appreciate your ministry and work.
I will say that I find people interesting. Mm-hmm. And when you're curious about people and are interested in seeing where's the spark of calling or the spark of love or the pain, it's always, a good thing to be in conversation with people.
Yeah.
So that makes me happy, and I'm glad when that makes other people happy too.
Yeah. For sure. Well, and maybe that's a good place to start with talking about like kind of spirituality and spiritual direction, because, maybe that's the entry point for sometimes like, so when you're thinking of investing in a person, like either in a spiritual direction sense or a student that you're mentoring or kind of in investing in along the way, like what's your approach? Like, what are you looking for? What are you looking to ask, to instill, those kinds of things?
Sure. I think my own awakening post-college, when I was taking early classes in seminary, I was working full-time in a publishing firm, so I took one class at a time. And I remember taking a class on the history of Christian spirituality, and they assigned us to read Alred of Ravoux from the 12th century, all about spiritual friendship, spiritual direction. I had never heard the term before. Mm-hmm. And it was like, what is that? Where can I get some of that? Mm-hmm. And did they do that in my tradition? And if so, what's that look like? And I think that was coupled with a even earlier understanding, which I think most people have, which is they want to know more about themselves, about God. Where do I find meaning? Where do I go when I'm stuck? Can God be in the hard things as well as the good things? And much of church life, growing up as I did in the church, I knew God was everywhere in sort of an abstract kind of way. But to know that, where do I find God or the holy in the mundane details of my life, or in the things that seem like total disasters, right? I didn't know. I kind of thought that was true, but I didn't know where to go with that. And I think the quest for spirituality is often that. How do I make sense of my life? Where do I connect with God? Where do I find meaning? And so I'm always interested in those questions. And I think when I'm teaching, I try to bring the questions and ask people to live into them. And that's where God takes over, right? You don't have to ask people to go a certain place. It's in encounter with those sort of existential questions, because we all have some of them. And spirituality is that place where we allow for that within a framework of trusting that we're not just navel-gazing or sorting out ourselves psychologically, that there's actually something bigger than that going on. That there is a God, that there is intention in the world, even when it seems like proof is not there.
Yeah. Well, especially being here. So we're recording this at Point Loma Nazarene University. We're, in the Wesley Center, and this is a place of theological education and those sorts of things. Like, I guess what strikes me is, I feel like even in my own work, my emphasis tends to be more on like theology and doctrine and big ideas and calling and, those kinds of things. And I feel like those don't necessarily rub up against spirituality in a bad way at all. Like in many ways they can become enmeshed, but they can also be very separate, right? And so like our personal spiritual journeys can sometimes feel detached from like the abstract ideas that we're talking about in sermons or in church or in Bible study or in, taking a theology class. Like, well, I don't know, would you distinguish spirituality from like theology, or, you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm getting at the question I'm looking for.
Sure. There's certainly a speculative and abstract way of doing theology. And we often do that to form our minds. And that's good. Spirituality is usually a little bit more about lived theology. How does that abstract idea actually get concretized? How does it get lived out in my own world? And if there's real disconnects between the ideal of what I've been wrestling with sort of intellectually and the reality of my life, in that tension is often where spirituality comes in. And it's, again, not just thinking, it's also sometimes learning how to practice or live in your world in a way that brings some more congruence between what you say you believe intellectually and the way you live your life. So there's a moral dimension to it, as well as a practicality. Yes.
And I mean, this is maybe a really broad question, but like, what does it mean to live like a meaningful spiritual life, like a reflective life that is taking those kind of spiritual questions seriously in a way that's like enriching life? Is that too big of a question to ask?
I don't think so. I guess what comes to my mind is just simply an illustration to say, sort of a simple practice that's been done by Jesuits and others for a really long time is the Prayer of Examen, right? To stop at the end of every day, look back over 24 hours or so and say, where did I find love and goodness and consolation and meaning? And where did I find the disconnects? And where did I feel like I was unhooked from the life source? Questions like that. Living a life that asks that kind of reflective musing at the end of a day, that's very prayerful. And a meaningful life is more rooted in that kind of reality of saying, oh, I keep finding that every day when I see the ocean, when I'm walking from here to there, I feel a little bit revived. And I feel like, it gives me energy for the rest of the day. You notice that, then you lengthen that gazing time from just walking fast from your car to actually saying, this is me connecting with the beauty of nature all around me. And that's a part of how I find meaning. And then if you find also places which, every time I'm, don't look at the ocean, or I'm too cranky, or I haven't eaten or whatever, I find that I get snappy with people. And I don't like to do that. So I keep doing that. So how do I infuse my life with the kind of choices that I do have control over? Because there's a lot we don't have control over.
Sure, yeah.
But when we do pay attention to the mindful ways of living, then all of a sudden the meaning part isn't just sort of waiting for some big, huge, transcendent moment where it's like, my life has meaning because blah, big thing. It's like, no, my life has meaning because every day I get to walk in beauty. My day has meaning because when I take care of myself, I can receive that person at 3:00 in the afternoon with happiness and joy, and maybe make a connection rather than, just getting cynical and dismissive, because I'm open to the opportunity of the day and the moment. So I think meaning is found in looking certainly at, what's it all about, questions, but also being very aware of how do I choose to live this day based on who I am, not some sort of model of what I think I should be, but with the hope of growing into the fullness of who we are.
Yeah, man. And I can see how so we've been doing not the examen, but a similar morning prayer practice that we've kind of encouraged our church folks to do. I don't know how many people are actually doing it, but our family's been trying to do it imperfectly. But in the morning, we're kind of thinking back on the day before and looking back at what wisdom can I learn from my experiences yesterday, and where do I need to ask for forgiveness, and where do I need to set my intention for today to, what am I looking to do today? And, you can see how that practice over time can help you to be more present in your days. It can help you plan better for the meaningful practices that are going to give you life. All the things that you're saying, you can see how just having that moment of check-in can actually guide your whole life if you let it, right? And that's a big part of sort of being spiritually aware of how you're doing and where you are. I want to ask, it's helpful in these conversations, I've found, to have some kind of framing work. And so the thing that I pitched to you when I asked you to come on here was to talk a little bit about Henri Nouwen, because I know you've worked with him some, and you've edited books or helped edit books that are, written in his name, and you've written forwards and those kinds of things. Not everybody knows who Henri Nouwen is. Our church, the Watershed Gathering at our church, the church board, just finished, or we're about to finish, one of his books on living a spiritual life. It's called Life of the Beloved, Spiritual Being in a Secular World, which is really good. His writing is so just graceful and simple, but deep at the same time. I guess I'm doing what I'm going to ask you to do. But could you kind of introduce Henri Nouwen a little bit? Tell us who he is and what his writing has been.
Sure. Well, Henri Nouwen was a Dutch-born Catholic priest who came to the United States to be really a pioneer in bringing classic contemplative spirituality together with the burgeoning world of psychology and pastoral theology. So he came from the Netherlands to first the Menninger Clinic and then Notre Dame to do this sort of really new work of trying to express in modern language the connections between, the call to connection with one another and issues of vulnerability and intimacy. So he was bringing two language systems, if you will, that are about pursuing meaning together. He called himself a hyphenated priest psychologist, right? Because he, in being the person he was called to be, didn't really fit tidily in either category, which led to the beauty of his writing, because he wanted to be pastoral. He didn't want to be clinical.
Right.
When he wrote his first books, they were more clinical. And it was only when he started writing pastorally that people began to say, what you're saying, and this is a quote from somebody that I heard say, you're basically writing the contours of my heart. How did you know? And only when he wrote from a personal and pastoral perspective did he connect with his readers, and he really did. And so being early in pastoral theology in a way that was very psychologically astute, not seeing them as completely separate, he was able to weave together the Christian spiritual tradition and self-reflection in a way that's been very meaningful to many people. That led him to an appointment at Yale, where he was for many years, very productive years. Then he went on to Harvard. And so he'd reached in writing in his second language. I always want to say he's writing in his second language.
I didn't even know that. I don't think I knew that because he's such a good writer.
Oh, he's amazing.
Yeah.
But he was writing in his second language. That he was very productive and wrote all these beautiful books. But he got to Harvard, sort of the pinnacle of the academic arena in the U.S. and in many places in the world. And he found himself very lonely. He said, there's a lot of people here, but nobody wants to pray with me. Everyone wants to debate. Some of his theological colleagues looked down on him and his classes because he was like filling these big classrooms to overflowing because people wanted to talk about prayer. And they're going, you're giving grades for people in prayer, right?
At Harvard?
Elite intellectual institution. And so it was a place that didn't feel like home. And that really set him on a journey of saying, where do I belong next? And I think this is where many of us that would resonate with words around the downward path or, solidarity with under-resourced peoples or whatever. It's where Henri kind of comes into the story. Because he thought he would probably move to South America, to Peru or something. And he went and tried to live among the poor and wrote some beautiful books. But somebody helped him recognize his job wasn't to live among the poor, but to announce and give voice to those who didn't have voice. And so he began writing differently. And eventually it ended that he received a call to come be a part of a L'Arche community or community that centers the disabled. And then he spent the last 10 years of his life at a L'Arche community in Canada. I met him when I was a young 20-something. I was an editor at Harper & Row Publishing, which has now got other names, Harper, San Francisco, etc. But it was a mainstream religious publisher. So I got the amazing education of working with all sorts of extraordinary thinkers and writers as the person who either photocopied or helped with the files or, worked with the copy editors or managed the kind of processes. But Henri was one of the authors who came through, so I got to know him and worked on some study guides and various things then. Simultaneously, my husband, who went to Yale, was a student of his during his Yale years. And so he knew him too. And so Henri was somebody we met in common, separately but had in common. So Henri would come to San Francisco at our little urban church that my husband was pastoring. And I like to say he would preach at St. Mary's and they'd give him a $5,000 honorarium and fill the place. And then he'd come over to us and hand the check over and have dinner with our homeless folks. And that tells you a lot about who he was.
Yeah.
And he was very interested in our ministry at the time. And so we stayed in touch with him, and he died in 1996, so it's been quite a long time now. But he was on sabbatical in New Jersey, where we were living at the time. So I actually did the last interview with him for a little publication I was working on, and we heard that he had died just days after. So I could still hear his voice in my head. And not long after that, I went to a spiritual director's training program, and people had heard that I knew Henri Nouwen because we were talking about him in light of his death. And all these people came and told me stories like the one I remember so distinctly was a woman saying she'd really struggled with infertility. Mm-hmm. And through that journey, Henri was the only person through his writing that could get to her, could give her consolation. And I thought, what's this Catholic priest who was never married and didn't have any kids and doesn't know anything about your life? What was it that made him sort of her spiritual director? Out of that came sort of a sense of call, I would say, to put together the first book of Henri Nouwen's writings on spiritual direction from a class that he taught at Yale in spiritual direction that my husband, the pack rat, still had his notes from.
So he still had all his notes, and you guys pulled them out and were able to like kind of consolidate some of his writing on spiritual direction specifically.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that was the first book. And we worked with the Henri Nouwen archives. They're at the University of Toronto. And so with the archivist pulling together articles he'd written and various kinds of things, as my husband likes to say, we helped Henry write a few more books that he would have if he had enough time.
Which, what a gift to the world to have more Henri Nouwen. I mean, he wrote a lot of books.
He wrote 40. He wrote 40.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what was it for the woman? What was it that was so significant in her spiritual life?
Well, I just think that, like the comment that I referred to by somebody else, it's like he knew the contours of suffering and vulnerability. And I think for this woman, that experience was so isolating and people didn't understand, or she didn't have people to talk to, that somebody who speaks to vulnerability and he speaks a lot to the temptation to self-rejection. And so I think it was that kind of humanity. I mean, that's the thing. Henry was known to say that he had learned that what's the most personal is actually the most universal, not in the particular details, but in the existential connection.
Yeah, which is how a Catholic priest, male Catholic priest, can connect with someone struggling with infertility, probably a totally different age than him.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
pretty much
She's a woman in her 20s, and he would have been a man in his, late 60s if he had lived, right? And I was like, what's the connection? And it is that touch of being really connected to your humanity, which he was.
And if you read him, like, you really can feel that in the writing. Like, he kind of understands loneliness, which is something that I think almost everybody deals with in today's age. Maybe people have always dealt with loneliness. I don't know. It seems like it's a bigger burden on contemporary people than it has been in the past. And he just knows those kind of spiritual wrestlings and wrestling with kind of faith and faithfulness and calling and finding meaning in the little things and being present and all, just all those things are such universal experiences, and he just brings them out so concisely and so beautifully that when you read him, you feel like he like you said, you feel like he's in your head or something.
Yeah,
like
that he started looking over your shoulder, or he knows what your life is like.
Yeah. So what have you taken away as like a spiritual director, someone who's kind of, your work is to do the same kind of pastoral work that he's doing in his books, and you're a writer too, but how do you, what do you take away from that? Like what did he teach you?
I think two of the things that I really take away from Henry, one is when he did spiritual direction, it was mostly through writing. He did some at the L'Arche community in Daybreak through what they called spiritual accompaniment. Mm-hmm. And so I love that word, that you're just really accompanying somebody and helping them as they sit in the presence of God to recognize what God may be doing, but they're too close to see it. Right?
Yeah.
And so you join people on this human journey, and you get to kind of be the scout to pay attention to what others, are bringing. They're the ones walking the journey. But sometimes you need a little friendly distance, right? Somebody else to help you see things. And so I think that's true of spiritual direction writ large, but Nouwen really had that sense of accompaniment. The few times I was with him one-on-one, there wasn't too many. It was usually between here or there. It was in groups. One time I remember being in a car with him, and he was a terrible driver because he preferred to talk, not drive. And so I remember just being like, look at he was taking me to the train station. I was like, look at the road. But what I remember, he was so curious about me. Huh. I was a mother of two small kids, working part-time. My husband was at graduate school. There was nothing very interesting about me. He thought I was so interesting. And I try to bring that to people because people are interesting.
Yeah.
And he brought that real... he saw people as gifts in his path, somebody to learn something from. So I think that enthusiasm for people comes from him. He also, in the book that we wrote on spiritual direction from his writings, he starts with sort of identifying persistent questions. Where do I belong? How can I be of service? Who is God to me? What is prayer? Questions that you kind of cycle through over and over again. Who am I? And I think it's been really helpful to have that in the back of my mind of saying, what persistent question am I hearing from this person? What is it that they really seem to be wrestling with? Is this an identity thing? Is this a calling question? Because often we're thinking about a concrete decision to be made, but there may be some bigger flow or bigger question that's at play just because they're there in our lives. We need to serve. We need to use our gifts. We need to belong. We need to have some healing from our pain. And so I think having some awareness that everybody's got a persistent question or something that's the big deal right now, that being able to listen with people for that is a part of the gift that he has offered.
Yeah, that's really helpful, actually. And I'm taking this in for myself in my own pastoral work, For those, so like as a pastor, I'm like, this is what I need to learn how to do better, But for many of the people that may be listening to this, not sort of in that role necessarily, but are in their own spiritual journey, trying to figure out, how to make big decisions or how to live a life where they're more present, or how to break a bad habit or many bad habits, or, apart from maybe just praying the examen or having those moments of check-in, like how would you suggest people go about fostering a more meaningful day-to-day spiritual life?
Yeah. The core that Henri Nouwen would put forward is to say, if you're going to really seek to discern, you need to be a part of a community. You got to be engaged with the discipline of the church, which you would say is community, Christian people. You have to be connected to the discipline of the book. You got to read the book somehow. And connect with the discipline of the heart. You've got to have some way of praying. That if you're seeking discernment but you're not doing those things, it's sort of like saying you want to, get stronger, but you have an aversion to lifting weights.
Yeah.
Right? Well, if you don't lift weights, then what are you going to do? Are you going to do push-ups? I don't want to do push-ups. I don't want anything. Well, you really don't want to get stronger then. Right? So there are some core practices. And then from that, questions of discernment, there's a whole other book on discernment. So if you want that one.
Yeah.
The book on discernment is sort of that if you're attending to you sort of accept the fact that God wishes to be known and wants to guide you. And so are you paying attention to the people on your path? What are people saying?
Yeah.
Right? If you actually want to do something and you ask people for their feedback about, what you're good at, or when they see you, falling off the wagon and picking up habits that have been things you've been trying to break, what do they see? When do you do that? What are others noticing?
Yeah.
They'll help you recognize your stresses or your weak points or whatever. So what are people saying?
Yeah.
And maybe what are other people saying? Are you asking other people who've actually changed that habit? What are you listening to people in your path? Or are you looking for some sort of magic solution that's only for you? Because most of the time, we're less unique than we think.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like so many of us are just we're so stubborn. We don't want to do the thing that everyone tells us to do. We want to find our own path.
We want to do it differently.
And sometimes like getting over ourselves a bit and just doing the thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
And go ahead.
That's discerning people in your path, sort of what time is it, both in your life. Is this a realistic time for you to do that thing? Right? Sometimes people are like, I want to, run off and join the circus. And so you got 3 kids, right? How many do you have?
3 boys.
Maybe if you tell me you want to run off and join the circus, I'll say, what time is it in your life, Chris?
I already live in the circus, Dr. Laird, so.
But to sort of say there are times in our lives and there are sometimes yearnings that will come to pass, so there'll be a moment for that.
Yeah.
But is it now? Is it too soon for that? So paying attention to the time in your life, the people in your path, some of those kinds of discernment questions really do help be a bit of a sorting hat. And it's not magic like the sorting hat is in Harry Potter. It's really sorting, because that's what really discerning is, sorting with the love of God to figure out what's the next step for me.
Reminds me of we went through some of the wisdom literature a few years ago, and I remember preaching on one of the passages in Proverbs where, wisdom is personified, and it's like wisdom is crying out to you from the street corners. It's calling after you all over the place. But if you won't listen, if you're not going to do the hard work of actually listening to the wisdom that's around you from your experiences, from being reflective on what you've been through, from the people around you who want to speak life and wisdom into your life, and kind of taking the time to engage in those practices. Like you said, it's like trying to get strong without working out, just probably not going to work very well.
No, and I find that sometimes in spiritual direction, people will come back and keep asking the same kind of thing. And sometimes they just have to keep talking to themselves until they actually hear themselves. Yeah. But sometimes it's the role of the director is to say, you keep asking the same question, but every time you commit to doing something, you don't take that step. Right. What's that about?
Yeah.
Right? Because sometimes discernment isn't easy, and sometimes the next steps that we take, there'll be a sense of rightness, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be without effort.
Yeah. Yeah, because sometimes the question is, what do I do? And sometimes, what you're supposed to do. And
What
it's just a matter of
what other support do you need? Or are you ready for a gentle nudge?
Yeah, yeah. How do you know? So, this is a question I'm trying to learn more for myself. I feel like today, again, I don't know if this is an issue for today or if this is an issue of all time, but I feel like it's really hard to even talk to close friends about hard things, to kind of be a little confrontational in seeing patterns that you think this person keeps telling me they're frustrated about this and I can see what they're doing and it's not working. But it feels like we're always supposed to just be always encouraging one another and always kind of affirming one another. And I think there is something beautiful about being in someone's corner and always having their back. But sometimes, we have to be able to tell someone something hard that they don't want to hear. I think that is probably the role of a spiritual director more than most. How do you do that? How do you do it gracefully and lovingly, and how do you do it in a way that can be heard and not rejected?
Yeah. I think that sometimes it's easier in a spiritual direction relationship than it is in a friendship, because people are intentionally coming to you for that. I tend to offer hard things with a little encouragement as well, not be too blunt. But the folks I work with around here will say sometimes in the morning, if you've not had your coffee, it comes out really straight, really blunt. It's like, whoa. So that can happen. But I think often you just sort of say, we've talked around this, and do you really want a direct response on this? And if they say yes, and usually people do, because they've been coming to you to try to sort things out. And then you say, you may not like this, but I'm going to just tell it to you straight.
Yeah.
I'm going to say it in as kind of a tone as I can, but I have to be really honest, right? I think most of the time people receive that as a good, if there's a relationship of trust. And usually that is, you don't do that early on because you wouldn't know what to say early on.
Sure.
You have to know somebody for a while. And they have to know that if they don't hear it that way, or they want to disregard what you say, that's their privilege too. Everybody, the person who's in spiritual direction or in any relationship, the agency belongs to them. People don't have to do what I think is right.
They don't.
They don't. And sometimes they do much better.
Sometimes they override you in their right.
Sometimes they actually know themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think that's helpful, to be able to give that word, even because sometimes it really takes courage to say something that you need to say, right? But to be able to be courageous and say the thing you need to say, but then also to let it go and say, all right, I've put it out there, I've kind of done my part in this, and now it's up to the person to kind of find their own way.
Yep. And I will love you whether you receive this or not.
Yeah.
I just feel like in the context, I'm sort of speaking as if I'm speaking to someone, but in the context of this relationship and this commitment, I need to say this. Yeah. And what you do with it is yours.
Right. Well, on the flip side of that, as someone who maybe receives a word of challenge or confrontation, how do you receive it well? Because I feel like there's different ways to receive it poorly. One, I think sometimes we tend to beat ourselves up and be so hypercritical. Someone says a word of slight non-approval, and then we just beat ourselves to death on it. And other times we're in such denial about the reality that we just can't hear it. How do we foster a kind of a presence and a being that is open to that kind of wisdom?
I think the daily practices are a part of that, right? If you're learning how to be reflective, if you're learning how to pause at the end of the day and look back, you'll see things that you're like, oof, not so great. I blew right past that person. Or, that was a cruel word. Woof. Right? So if you're in a reflective mode and you are willing to see those places in the small things and in the sort of in the privacy of your own being, then learning how to take feedback begins to be a part of your assumption about life. There are things that I can't see at the time. There are things that I'm too close to see. And that this trusted person who prays for me and who loves me, if they're going to say this, then I'll at least have to go think about it. Right? And I do think that a good spiritual director will know somebody to know whether they err on the side of scrupulosity or on the side of, small criticisms are going to go beat themselves up. You're going to be very careful. Right. And to say, I know you might take this word and go home and use it as some sort of way to, beat yourself up with. Let's not take that tact. If you start to feel like you can beat yourself up, is there another way to think about how can you hold that, right? How could you hold this information? Because you're helping the person not only hear the information, but to sort of figure out what to do with it.
Yeah.
If there's somebody else who's like easy to just sort of dismiss, that they don't like stuff, and if they hear a negative thing, then they're just going to say, she's just full of it, right? I don't need to listen to her. It's sort of like, it took a lot for us to get to this. Will you make a commitment to think about it tonight? Take 10 minutes to think about this. Right? So if you know somebody, these kinds of things, if somebody's really hard on themselves or a little too easy on themselves, you usually have some sense of that.
Yeah, so you can kind of adjust I think we all kind of do that just naturally with friends. We know people who have different tendencies, and we can kind of adjust our communication in mind of that. Yeah. Well,
Encouragement's more fun.
Encouragement is absolutely more fun. Yeah.
I would also say I have a philosophy. I think it came out of some of my graduate work and picking a methodology. I worked with appreciative inquiry kinds of methodology. And it's sort of looking at a situation, a person, an institution, and trying to identify where is this thing growing. It's sort of like if you see a plant in a room, it's going to grow to the light. How is this person growing? How can you be a part of that? And a plant can grow and flourish and bloom even if there's dead branches over here.
Yep,
you don't have to try to make everything tidy. And so in trying to help people grow in the direction of, where God's energy is found.
Yeah.
Or where they come to life, it's easier to help people grow. And as they're growing, then sometimes the snipping away of some of these other dead branches doesn't matter so much. But
right.
if people are in a season when they don't feel there's been any greenness or any growth, or life's been so hard, and I think encouragements is often tend that way. Lean into that.
Yeah. It's so like in our context, we have a lot of people that are they're in crisis a lot, in life, and sometimes people need both. They need encouragement because it can be so disheartening to experience homelessness, for example, or to struggle with addiction and have relapses. And it can be, it's so tempting to just despair and give up. And I think we need that encouragement. But then also I think people often need to be challenged too, because there's, in the harsher experiences of the world, we end up developing a lot of bad habits because of our sort of limited resources, limited ability to cope. Like we pick up things that are unhelpful and that are kind of continuing to cycle us in. And I don't know, you've been in those contexts a lot. Do you have any advice for a church like ours as we try to find our way towards discipleship? You know a bit about our church.
Yeah, I do. I do. And I love your church. I love the one room context of, come and bring all the things, whether you need to plug in your phone or you need food or
Yep.
it's a rainy night or it's worship time or whatever. I think, and this is basic stuff, but when people know you really care, that's job one, right? How do you get through a horrible day? Somebody offers some humanity to you. And then the long-term things, it's accountability and knowing that, most people mess up a few times before they get it right. All that kind of love and compassion serves well. But if people are caught in the depths of multiple challenges, they need multiple people. Right? It's the mosaic of care, I think, that helps. And a spiritual director can help with a piece of it. You need the social worker, and you need the clinician, and you need the housing advocate, and there's no easy solution to that. But I think encouraging people to sort of say, this is your team, your group, and it's not just to help you, but that you are you're a gift to this group too. Everybody here needs to give, and you need to give. Where are you offering something back, buddy?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And I think that's when we mentioned the L'Arche community before. One of the things I really learned from L'Arche is that it's a with. And not one person can't be on the receiving end all the time, and one person or groups of people being on the giving end, because that's warped.
Right.
It's with, and that's hard sometimes for people who are struggling so hard to just survive. But I think when that is touched every once in a while, and you see the gift in somebody and they get to offer it when they've just felt like they have nothing to offer, that is, in my experience, often when the growth begins. It's that growing toward the light, but you've got to have your switch turned on.
For sure. And that was, so like our church was, for those, many of you who maybe listen to this know this because you're part of the church, but we were kind of born out of this desire to get over this one-way relationship of like, we come downtown and feed you,
That's right,
and you receive, and to say, how can we be brothers and sisters in Christ together, and how can we serve alongside one another and be served alongside one another? And I think, there's been seasons in the life of our church we've done that really well, and others where it's been a bit of a struggle. But I think keeping that door open and inviting people to serve and encouraging people to step into that invitation, in some ways, having someone volunteer for something is more full of life and growth and spiritual richness than any kind of like blessing you can give from your word of mouth or anything the community can do to support you. It's to offer that chance, because there's so much dignity and empowerment in that. So hopefully we can continue on that legacy and pick it up in areas that it's kind of dropped off for us.
Yeah. Henri Nouwen, at the end of his life when he went to L'Arche, one of the things he began to recognize was that rather than, he kept getting big speaking engagements, but he said rather than announcing the people at L'Arche, he's going to take people with him.
Oh, yeah.
So he took, at the last couple years of his life, all of his speaking engagements, he took one of the core members, one of the people with disabilities, with him. And they would steal the show. And afterwards, no one would remember what Henri said, and it bothered him because he was used to being sort of people hanging on every word.
Yeah.
And now they weren't necessarily. They were thinking about what Bill said, or they were thinking about what the core members said. And he recognized that was also the call of his spiritual reality at that time of his life, was to, he said he wanted to announce the poor and lift up the voices that were voiceless. And one of the ways to do that was to take somebody with a different voice with him, and then to get over himself.
Right. And step aside, right? And let the spotlight change.
And let the deep wisdom that often came in a package that people would never have listened to if he wasn't standing next to them. let that be God's messenger. And it was a big ego learning.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a challenge. And I mean, someone like Nouwen is so transparent that he would share it with everybody else in ways that are helpful for us. So, I've taken a lot of your time here. I really appreciate you coming.
Thank you for asking. I like talking about these.
Yeah. For those who haven't read much Henri Nouwen, is there any book or books that you would recommend as like an entryway into the depth of his?
Well, I think everybody has their favorite. The Return of the Prodigal Son is probably it's probably the one that has the summary of his vision, right? Henry wrote a lot of books, but the themes are pretty persistent. And once he began to write about our belovedness, that's the core of our identity, that really articulates almost everything else he's talking about. And so I think the Prodigal Son probably speaks to that one as well. We have the ones I worked on were spiritual direction, spiritual formation, and one of the reasons that book has been helpful is it has a lot of art in it, because Nouwen was a great lover of art. He traveled with a little icon of Rublev's Old Testament Trinity, and he loved Van Gogh, so almost everywhere he went, he'd get sunflowers and put them in a vase. He needed beautiful images and things around him. So that brings some of the visual aspects of spiritual formation, because spiritual formation needs to have some embodiment, and it needs to use your senses and not just your brain. So Nouwen's books that do bring some of that together, and that spiritual formation is one of those. He's written some books. He wrote a book on icons, Behold the Beauty of the Lord, describing how praying with an icon is not an idolatry, but it's a praying as if there's a window to God in front of you. And it's beautiful. Yeah. So he looks through some of these ancient icons. So he had different seasons.
Yeah.
And it depends on whether you like the sort of more interfaith early exploration or the psychological engagement times, or whether his sort of refined time at L'Arche where he really understood the interior life and community.
Yeah, he wrote about so many things. I even wrote a book of his on fundraising.
It is a spirituality of fundraising.
Yeah. Like, if I have to read something on fundraising, which I think I have to do, might as well read Henri Nouwen instead of some other.
Yeah, but it's deeply relational.
Yeah,
I mean, that's what it's all about, is people need to give.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Any closing thoughts, anything you want to say before we close it out?
Just thank you for the opportunity. I just think that I love what you do at Living Water, and I know that anybody who's trying to look for the dignity of God and the gift of God in others, particularly those who wear, as Mother Teresa would say, sometimes the distrusting disguise. Mm-hmm. I'm all about that, and Henri was too. So I think that's why he resonated with me. So fun conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your time, for all your encouragement over the years, and for your work. Well, thanks.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
We'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening, all you current people. And thanks again, Dr.
My pleasure. My pleasure.